Hello, sisters. Okay. Lesbian Psychologies, Explorations and Challenges edited by the Boston Lesbian Psychologies Collective. Part 1, Identity, Essay 2. Issues of Identity in the Psychology of Latina Lesbians by Olivia M. Espín. Identity development for persons of ethnic or racial minority groups involves not only the acceptance of an external reality that can rarely be changed, example, being Black, Puerto Rican, Jewish, or Vietnamese, but also an intrapsychic quote-unquote embracing of that reality as a positive component of oneself. By definition, in the context of a heterosexist, racist, and sexist society, the process of identity development for Latina lesbian women entails the embracing of quote-unquote stigmatized or quote-unquote negative identities. Coming out to self and others in the context of a sexist and heterosexist American society is compounded by coming out in the context of a heterosexist and sexist Latin culture immersed in racist society. Because as a Latina, she is an ethnic minority person, she must be bicultural in American society. Because she is a lesbian, she has to be polycultural among her own people. The dilemma for Latina lesbians is how to integrate who they are culturally, racially, and religiously with their identity as lesbians and women. The identity of each Latina lesbian develops through conscious and unconscious choices that allot relative importance to the different components of the self, and thus to her identity as woman, as lesbian, as Latina. Identity development. The term identity is understood here as that which woman tells herself about who she is when she is alone with herself. The term is also understood as that which each context to which she is field sensitive calls forth in a given moment. In other words, identity is also associated with social image. According to Erik Erikson, the crises conducive to the development of an integrated identity consists of, quote, a state of being and becoming that can have a highly conscious and indeed self-conscious quality, yet remain in its motivational aspect quite conscious and be set with the dynamics of conflict, end quote. Part of what because a quote part of identity must be accounted for in that communality within which an individual finds himself, end quote, there might be, quote, fragments that the individual had to submerge in himself as undesirable or irreconcilable, or which him to perceive as the mark of a fatal difference in sexual or race, in class or religion, end quote. For both lesbians and ethnic minority persons of both sexes, and indeed for ethnic minority lesbians, the process of identity development is full of vastitudes and it frequently demands the submerging of different fragments of the self. However, as, quote, certain historical periods present a singular chance for a collective renewal which opens up unlimited identities for those who, by a combination of unruliness, giftedness, and competence, represent a new elite, a new and new types in a new people, end quote. We seem to be living in such a period, and ethnic minority lesbians seem to be at a crucial point in this psychological process. Obviously, different individuals are at different stages of identity development. That is to say, different stages of clarity about who they are, or chosen, by which people classify each other and themselves, including embracing those aspects of identity considered to be negative by the group or groups to which the individual belongs. The process is not necessarily linear for any given individual. In fact, identities are fluid, as is the process of developing them. Donald Atkinson, George Morton, and Daryl Dwayne Sue have evolved a model of identity development for ethnic minorities that captures the fluidity of the process and describes its phases in a clear and concise way. Table 1. Vivian Cass has developed a similar theoretical model in reference to homosexual identity formation. Both models incorporate the different possible reactions to a negative identity that ethnic minority persons and homosexuals can have at different points in life. In the Atkinson, Morton, and Sue model, stage 1, conformity is characterized by a preference for dominant culture values over one's own culture. The reference group is likely to be the dominant cultural group, and feelings of self hatred, negative beliefs of one's own culture, and positive feelings towards the dominant group are likely to be strong. The second stage, or dissonance, is characterized by cultural confusion and conflict. Information and experiences begin to challenge accepted values and beliefs. Active questioning of the dominant held values operates strongly. In stage 3, resistance and immersion, an active rejection of the dominant society and culture and a complete endorsement of minority held views becomes evident. Desires to combat oppression become the primary motivation of the person. There is an attempt to get in touch with one's history, culture, and traditions. Distrust and hatred of dominant society is strong. The reference group is one's own culture. Stage 4, introspection, is characterized by conflict at the too narrow and rigid constraints of the previous stage. Notions of loyalty and responsibility to one's own group and notions of personal autonomy come in conflict. In stage 5, synergistic articulation and awareness, individuals experience a sense of self fulfillment with regard to cultural identity. Conflicts and discomfort experienced in the introspective stage have been resolved, allowing greater individual control and flexibility. Cultural values are examined and accepted or rejected on the basis of prior experience gained in earlier stages of identity development. Desire to eliminate all forms of oppression becomes an important motivation in the individual's behavior. Vivian Cass's model proposes 6 stages of development that individuals move through in order to acquire a fully integrated identity as a homosexual person. In stage 1, identity confusion, the individual realizes that feelings, thoughts, or behavior can be defined as homosexual, and this realization presents an incongruent element in a previously stable situation in which both the individual and the environment assumed the person to be heterosexual. As a result of this incongruency, the individual arrives at a self identity potentially that potentially that of a homosexual. Quote, where the task of stage 1 was to resolve the immediate personal identity crisis of who am I, the task of stage 2, identity comparison, is to handle the social alienation that now arises. End quote. In stage 3, identity tolerance, there is an increased level of commitment to the homosexual self image. Quote, at this stage, contacting homosexuals is viewed as something that has to be done in order to counter the self isolation and alienation from others. The individual tolerates rather than accepts a homosexual identity. End quote. Stage 4, identity acceptance, is, quote, characterized by continued and increasing contact with other homosexuals. These allow the person to feel the impact of those features of the subculture that validates and normalizes homosexuality as an identity and a way of life. The individual now accepts rather than tolerates a homosexual self image. End quote. Entrance into stage 5, identity pride, is characterized by the incongruencies that exist between a concept of the self as totally acceptable as a homosexual and society's rejection of this concept. In order to manage this incongruency, heterosexuals and heterosexuality are devalued. A combination of anger and pride is developed. Confrontation with the environment may occur. More and more strategies previously used to conceal a homosexual identity are deliberately abandoned. Disclosure becomes a strategy for coping. Stage 6, identity synthesis, starts, quote, with an awareness that the them and us philosophy espoused previously, in which all heterosexuals are viewed negatively and all homosexuals viewed positively, no longer holds true. Personal and public sexual identities become synthesized into one image of self receiving of self, receiving considerable support from the environment. Homosexual identity, instead of being seen as as the identity, is now given the status of being merely one aspect of the self. This awareness completes the homosexual identity formation process. End quote. Although these two models are not identical, they describe a similar process that must be undertaken by people who must embrace negative or stigmatized identities. This process moves gradually from rejected and denied self image to the embracing of an identity that is finally accepted as positive. Both models describe one or several stages of intense confusion, and at least one stage of complete separatism and rejection of all representatives of the dominant society. The final stage for both models implies the acceptance of one's own identity, a committed attitude against oppression, and an ability to synthesize the best values of both perspectives and to communicate with members of the dominant group. Latina lesbians. It can be reasonably asserted that the development of identity in Latina lesbians must follow patterns similar to those described by these two models. However, I do not know of any studies on this topic. Indeed, the literature on Latina lesbians is scarce. Professional presentation by Hortensia Amaro discussed the issue of coming out for Hispanic lesbians, and some literary discussions that address the experiences of Latina lesbians have been published by Cherry Morega. Although there might be studies in process on this population, very few have been published. Hilda Hidalgo and Elia Hidalgo Christensen have published two versions of a study of Puerto Rican attitudes towards lesbianism. Yvonne Escacerga and her collaborators study the attributes of Chicana lesbians towards psychotherapy. To my knowledge, no other research studies focus particularly on Latina lesbians or the specific aspect of their identity development. Although emotional and physical closeness among women is encouraged by Latin culture, overt acknowledgement of lesbianism is even more restricted than in mainstream American society. Hidalgo and Hidalgo Christensen, for example, discuss the importance of amigas intimas, intimate female friends, for Puerto Rican women, and contrast it with the results of their research that show that most members of the Puerto Rican community strongly reject lesbianism. They found that, quote, rejection of homosexuals appears to be the dominant attitudes in the Puerto Rican community, end quote. At a meeting of Hispanic women in a major U.S. city in the early 1980s, one participant expressed the opinion that, quote, lesbianism a sick is a sickness we get from American women and American culture, end quote. This is, obviously, an expression of the common belief that homosexuality is a chosen behavior acquired through the bad influence of others. Socialist attitudes with respect to homosexuality are extremely traditional, as the attitudes of the Cuban and other revolutions clearly manifest. Thus, Latinos who consider themselves radical and committed to civil rights may remain extremely traditional when it comes to gay rights. In a book titled Pleasure and Danger Exploring Female Sexuality, I have discussed the impact of the prevalent Latin attitudes on Hispanic women who have a lesbian orientation. These attitudes clearly add further stress to the lives of Latina lesbians who are invested in participating in the life of their communities. Although these attitudes may not seem different from those of the dominant cultures, some important differences experienced by Latina lesbians are directly related to Hispanic cultural patterns. Latin families tend to treat their lesbian daughters or sisters with silent tolerance. Their lesbianism will not be openly acknowledged and accepted, but they are not denied a place in the family either. Very seldom is there overt rejection of their lesbian family members on the part of Hispanic families. The family may explain away the daughter's lesbianism by saying that, quote, she is too intelligent to marry a man, and end quote, or quote, too dedicated to her work to bother dating, marriage, or motherhood, end quote. Nevertheless, because of frequent contact and a strong interdependence among family members, even in adult life, are essential features of Hispanic family, leading a double life may become more of a strain. Because of the importance placed on family and community by most Hispanics, the threat of possible rejection and stigmatization by the Latin community becomes more of a psychological burden for the Hispanic lesbian. Rejection from the mainstream society does not carry the same weight. As Cherry Moraga puts it, quote, that is not to say that Anglo culture does not stigmatize its women for quote unquote gender transgression, only that it is stigmatized that its stigmatization did not hold the personal power over me which Chicano culture did. End quote. To avoid stigmatization by the Latin community, Hispanic lesbians frequently seek other groups or networks in which their lesbian orientation will be more accepted than it is by their family and its community. However, as Hortensio Amara states, quote, reliance on alternative support groups outside the Hispanic community would not occur without a cost. Loss of contact with the ethnic community and culture will mean lack of support for their identity as a Hispanic. On the other hand, staying within the Hispanic community and not quote unquote coming out will represent a denial of the identity associated with sexuality and intimate love relationships. End quote. To be out of the closet only in an Anglo context deprives them of an essential support from their communities and families, and in turn increases their invisibility in the Hispanic culture, where only the openly quote unquote butch types are recognized as lesbian. To complicate matters even further, Latina lesbians sometimes experience discrimination or more subtle forms of racism, not only from the mainstream of American society, but also within the context of the Anglo lesbian community, in which they continue to be in numerical minority. Many Latina lesbians who are lesbians, no, many Latina women who are lesbians choose to remain closeted among their families, their colleagues, and society at large. Coming out may jeopardize not only the strong family ties, but also the possibility of serving the Hispanic community. This is particularly difficult because the talents of all members are such an important aspect for any minority community. Because most lesbian women are single and self supporting and not encumbered by the demands of husband and children, it can be assumed that the professional experience and educational level of Hispanic lesbians will tend to be relatively higher than that of other Hispanic women. Because there are no statistics on Hispanic lesbians, this assertion cannot be easily proved. But if it is true, professional experience and education will frequently place Latina lesbians in positions of leadership or advocacy in their community. Their status and prestige, and thus the ability to serve their community, will be easily threatened by the possibility of being found out by the very same people they are trying to serve. Cuban lesbians. Having provided some background on the development of identity in minority persons and on the experience of Latina lesbians, I will present what a group of Cuban lesbians have to say about the different components of their identity. I was prompted by a recognition of the problems encountered by Latina lesbians to study the relative importance of these identity components in a group of such women. I wanted to assess the relative degree of cultural and lesbian identity for this group. How did these women integrate the different components of the self in the process of identity formation? I decided to limit my study to Cuban women in order to reduce the number of intervening factors that may differentiate among Hispanic subgroups. Although the study focuses on Cuban women, the results serve to illustrate general principles relevant to the identity development of other Latina and minority lesbians. The study. I distributed a questionnaire in the appendix through friendship pyramiding among Cuban lesbians in several cities in the United States and analyzed the responses primarily through the use of qualitative methods. Qualitative methodology provided a legitimate and flexible format for an exploratory study based on a sample of convenience obtained through friendship pyramiding, such as this one. I kept both the Atkinson, Morton, and Sue model of ethnic minority identity development and the Cass model of homosexual identity development as background for understanding the process of identity formation of the respondents. However, I made no effort at coding questions on the basis of the stages described in these two models. Because there is no other study published on this specific population of lesbians, I saw value in examining how they themselves described their experience without superimposing any previously determined model of analyses. I mailed 35 questionnaires, 15 to specific individuals and 20 in small packets of 5 to people who had offered to contact others. 16 completed questionnaires were returned. The respondents expressed great enthusiasm for the study, and almost all of them asked to be sent results and to be kept informed about any further study on this matter. It is important to acknowledge the possibility that respondents are only among those women who have embraced the multiple components of their identity enough to be willing to answer and return the questionnaire. In fact, I heard through the grapevine that some of the prospective respondents felt their lesbianism was a quote unquote trial sent by God, which they had to suffer and endure, and thus found the questionnaire too difficult and decided not to answer it. In addition, because the questionnaire was written in English, it presupposes literacy in English on the part of the prospective respondents, at least to be able to read it. Respondents were encouraged to answer in Spanish if they preferred. However, although some Spanish was used, questionnaires were primarily answered in English. A further consideration is that respondents were highly educated and perhaps not representative of the population of Cuban lesbians in the United States. The questionnaire was brief. It consisted of 3 pages, preceded by a demographic fact sheet in which questions such as occupation, place of residence, and age were asked. Because I wanted to make the questionnaire easy and to the point, some richness of data may have been lost. In the study, it is to expect expanded sorry. If the study is to be expanded in the future, in-depth interviewing should be used to follow up. The questionnaire was completed anonymously. Respondents who were interested in the results of the study were asked to submit a request under separate letter or postcard. Before presenting the data, I must reiterate that both sexuality and ethnicity, regardless of how quote unquote inborn or quote unquote born into or quote unquote given at birth, are, in fact, fluid, lifelong processes. What I think of myself today in terms of either ethnicity or sexuality may not be what I thought yesterday or what I will think tomorrow. Because, quote, what each woman thinks of herself, end quote, is what I define as identity for my purposes here. I have included those women who consider themselves appropriate participants of this study by responding to the questionnaire. That is why one of the respondents, a 23-year-old woman born in Hialeah, Florida, a short while after her family immigrated to the United States, is included in the study. She defines herself as Cuban, so she can be considered as such for the purposes of this study. Characteristics of the group. The age of the 16 respondents ranged between 23 to 45, with a mean of 32 years. 15 of the respondents were born in Cuba. One was born in Florida. 11 of the 16 are either the oldest child or the oldest daughter in the family. Their places of residence are fairly evenly distributed across the United States. Responses came from Florida, California, the Midwest, and the Northeast. On the basis of their parents' occupation and education in Cuba and in the United States, it can be estimated that 3 come from middle upper class socioeconomic backgrounds, 7 from middle class backgrounds, and 6 from low middle or working class backgrounds. The occupations of the respondents varied, but they were all highly educated. 3 of the respondents held doctorates, 1 was a physician, 1 was a lawyer, and 2 were law students. 5 had master's degrees, and 5 had bachelor's degrees, and 1 was a professional writer. This high level of education may be an effect of the friendship pyramiding process of recruiting participants for the study. On the other hand, it may be that high level of education found in this group is a confirmation of what was hypothesized earlier in this chapter concerning the level of education of Latina lesbians compared to the general population of Latinas in the United States. 14 of the 16 women were raised Catholic, 1 was Methodist, and the other Episcopalian. Only 3 of them practiced their religion, and at the time of the study. These 3 women were members of Dignity, a national organization of gay and lesbian Catholics. I'm so sorry. Okay. Of the 16 women, 15 were involved in a committed relationship. 9 of them were in relationships with Cuban or other Hispanic women. 5 in relationships with Jewish women, 1 with an African American woman, and 1 with a white Anglo woman. The 15 women who were born in Cuba had arrived in the United States between 1956 and 1972. Thus, their length of residence in this country ranged from 7 to 28 years, with a mean of 18 years. Their age of leaving Cuba ranged from 3 to 22. 12 participants left Cuba between 3 and 13 years of age. 1 left at 17, 2 at 21, and 1 at 22. Most of them left Cuba during their childhood years, and only 3 left in early adulthood. Coming out as lesbian occurred from 21 years earlier, 1962, to as recently as a few months before the questionnaire was filled out. The ages of coming out ranged from 16 to 33 years old. As is usual with the lesbian population, chronological age does not correlate with the number of years of being out, except for those who have been out 21 or 18 years, who, obviously, were among the oldest respondents. 5 of the women were out to all members of their family, including parents. 6 were out to siblings or other relatives, and 5 were not out to anyone in their families. Most of them were out to friends, and most of them preferred to socialize with people who they knew were lesbians. Oh no, preferred to socialize with people who knew they were lesbians. Okay. Responses to the core questions. Several questions are being considered to be the core questions of the study. Questions 5 and 6 asked the participants if they identified as Cuban and as lesbian, respectively. Questions 7 and 8 asked for a brief description of the process of identifying as Cuban and as lesbian. Questions 9 and 10 ask them about the influence of living in the United States may have had on them as lesbians and as Cubans. Question 11 asked for the relative importance that being Cuban or being lesbian had in their lives. Question 12 asked about their decision making in choosing friends among Latin people who are not gay or among Anglo lesbians. This question was intended to elicit reflections on the process of emotional costs involved in this decision. "14 of the women, including the young woman born in Florida, identify as Cuban. The two respondents who do not identify as Cuban live in Florida. One of them is 31 years old. She came to this country in 1956, before the larger waves of Cuban migration, and was raised, in her own words, quote, as an Anglo among Anglos, end quote. The other woman, who does not identify as Cuban, is 42 years old and came to Miami from Cuba in 1962 when she was 20. She was the only woman in the group who was in a relationship with a white Anglo woman. Although she came to the United States as an adult and lives in the geographical area where the largest concentration of Cubans in this country is, she strongly rejects Cuban ways. In her own words, quote, "It is great to be able to know and share black beans and rice and talk Spanish. But if we cannot be ourselves, we cannot share with one another if our waves do not click. To what good is Spanish if we cannot communicate? I am afraid black beans and rice are not enough. Latins are provincial, non-worldly, ignorant, superstitious, with no room for individuality, self-expression, non-progressive, politically oppressive, bound by archaic traditions that enslave people. Come to Miami. See the butch femme still alive and well. Very disturbing. These are 17 to 25-year-olds." End quote. Among the descriptions of their processes of self-definition as Cuban, two responses seem to express the general sentiment more precisely. A 33-year-old woman who had lived in the United States for 23 years described her process in the following way, quote, "As a child, this self-definition was not conscious, since there was no need for awareness of ethnic identity while I lived in Cuba. Coming to the United States instantly brought to my awareness, at the age of 10, what being Cuban meant in this country. I could say that the need to assert that identity was strengthened by racism of the United States. In my teens, I passed through a period of acculturation into which a period of acculturation in which, to some extent, I internalized society's view of ethnic groups in a very subtle way. During college, I became active in political and community activities and went through a quote unquote militant phase in which I came to understand the nature of racism and oppression more deeply. Presently, I consider myself to have a more universal or humanistic perspective, and I am able to appreciate as well as critically analyze aspects of my cultural heritage." End quote. This woman's description of her process as an ethnic minority person clearly fits Atkinson, Morton, and Sue's model of ethnic minority identity development described earlier. When confronted with a culture different from her own, she evolved from a conformity stage as an adolescent to a more synergistic stage at this moment in her life. Another respondent, a 45-year-old woman who had lived in the United States for 12 years, said the following about being Cuban in this country. Quote, "It is difficult to be cut off from the Cuban community while not feeling understood by Americans and sometimes even by other lesbians. Being Cuban at this point in history is not easy." End quote. The vicissitudes of the process of self-identification as a lesbian woman are described best by the following two responses. Quote, "First, total unawareness. Then, after sleeping with a woman, total rejection of her, as if she was an addiction. I knew this was quote unquote sick. I never went to bed with so many men in my life as I did during that period. Then, I started realizing that I was denying my own happiness. Now, I am almost totally out. I feel whole." End quote. Quote, "Although I had been intensely involved with another woman, we both denied it. When I became involved with a woman who defined herself as lesbian, I thought I was not lesbian, only quote unquote in love with her. Then I started feeling attracted to other women, became involved in gay groups. I'm now out at work and to friends. Family is impossible, though. End quote. The internal journeys described by these two women, as well as by other respondents, fit the processes involved in developing a homosexual identity as described in Vivian Cass's model. Interestingly, one of the respondents does not identify as a lesbian. According to her, quote, "No, my sexual preference does not rule my life. I like women. I love women. That is called being a lesbian, but I don't define myself as one." End quote. In spite of these words, this woman, who at 40 years old has been out for 18 years, chose to answer the questionnaire knowing that it was about lesbians. When asked what was more important for them, being Cuban or being lesbian, 12 women responded that they were equally important. 3 women responded that being a lesbian was more important, and one responded that, quote unquote, being a Latin woman was more important. Because, quote, being a Latin woman gives me a broader perspective culturally and politically. This person, end quote. This person is the same one who said she did not define herself as a lesbian. When confronted with the choice of being among Latins without coming out, or living among lesbians who are not Latin, or who are unfamiliar with Latin culture, 11 of the women said they had chosen and would choose the second alternative. However, this choice is not made without ambivalence. A 29-year-old woman from San Francisco explained her choice in this way, quote, "Una pregunta muy difícil," end quote, a very difficult question. Oh, sorry, not end quote. "I have done both. I think being able to be a lesbian is too much a part of me for me to repress. I can still be Cuban if I'm around Americans." End quote. A 27-year-old woman from Miami expressed not only the ambivalence but also the pain and anger associated with choosing between different parts of herself. Quote, "I guess that if the choice were absolute, I would choose living among lesbians. This answer may invalidate my answer to question 11, in which I said that being Cuban and being lesbian were both equally important to me, but I want to point out that I would be extremely unhappy if all my Latin culture were taken out of my lesbian life. I had a hard time with all the questions that made me choose between Cuban and lesbian, or at least made me feel as if I had to choose. It made it really It made it real clear to me that if I identify myself as a lesbian more intensely than as a Cuban/Latin, sorry, it made it clear to me that I identify myself as a lesbian more intensely than as a Cuban/Latin. But it is a very painful question because I feel that I am both, and I don't want to have to choose. Clearly, straight people don't even get asked this question, and it is unfair to me to have to discuss it, even if it is just a questionnaire." End quote. Two of the respondents said that when confronted with the choice, they prefer to be among Latinos. The reason given by one of them for her choice was, quote, "I feel comfortable with my people, gay or not." End quote. 3 women said they would not choose without explaining how they have integrated both alternatives in their lives. One woman expressed a strong rejection against the possibility of such a choice. Quote, "I would refute that choice and insist on the third alternative of not denying either aspect of myself. This is a false dichotomy, as we all know, sort of like saying, are you a woman or an ethnic person? Such choices arise out of racism and homophobia, and I refuse to even postulate such possibility for myself." End quote. It is not clear if this woman has in fact answered the question in terms of her own personal choices, or if she's primarily making a statement about what she considers to be correct, or taking a political position. On the other hand, this woman was the most out person in the group, perhaps because she was out to her parents and family as well as to all the important people in her life. She could actively act out her refusal to choose in a better way than others. From the responses of this small group, we can conclude that it is impossible to determine that one aspect of the identity of these Cuban lesbians is more important for them than the other. The relative importance given to the different components of their identity does not appear to be related, at least in this group, to factors such as age, years of residence in the United States, place of residence, or any other factors. In fact, the two most extreme and definite positions, that of not wanting to identify as Cuban or as lesbian, are espoused by women who are more than 40, 42, and 40, respectively, who have both been living in the United States for more than 20 years and out as lesbians for 20 or 18 years, respectively. The woman who rejects her Cuban identity lives in Miami. The woman who rejects her lesbian identity lives in New York. Most of the respondents, although regretting their decision, chose behaviorally to be among Anglo lesbians rather than among straight Latinos. The possibility of quote unquote passing or not must be a factor in the decision. Obviously, they cannot hide their Hispanic identity among Anglos as they can hide their lesbian identity among Hispanics. But even when they believe that it is easier to be Cuban among lesbians than it is to be lesbian among Cubans, they do not feel fully comfortable not being both. In fact, what most of them say is that they feel more whole when they can be out as both Cubans and as lesbians. However, because of the realities of racism and heterosexism that they have to confront, they are forced to choose for their lives those alternatives that are more tolerable or less costly to them. Some may choose to live in Miami among Cubans, even if that implies quote unquote staying in the closet. Others may choose to live in other areas of the country among Anglo lesbians without feeling fully supported in terms of their Cuban identity. However, as expressed by one woman, quote, eating black beans and rice while speaking Spanish with other Latina lesbians makes those beans taste like heaven, end quote. Implications for psychotherapy. Some implications for the practice of psychotherapy with Latina lesbians can be derived from the discussion of the specific factors influencing the identity development of Latina lesbians and from results of the brief study. Like all the other individuals who seek psychotherapy, Latina lesbians who come to therapy do so for a variety of reasons. As with all other individuals, the formation of their identity occurs in a specific cultural, class, and historical context. For the therapist working with Latina lesbians, it is essential to understand the impact of these specific contextual variables on the individual client. But the understanding of the unique vicissitudes of identity development for Latina lesbians should be tempered by the understanding that certain processes are similar to those encountered by any lesbian woman from any cultural background who is in the process of coming out. It is essential that the therapist understands the anger, frustration, and pain that the Latina lesbian experiences, both as a lesbian and as an ethnic minority member. If the therapist is a white Anglo, it is essential that she develop awareness and understanding of how her own cultural background influences her responses to her Latina lesbian client. If the therapist has a heterosexual orientation, particularly if the therapist is also Hispanic, freedom from heterosexist biases and male centered cultural values and from Latin stereotypes of homosexuals is essential for effective therapy. Of particular importance is the use of language in therapy when the client's associations to Spanish words that refer to her lesbian identity may all be negative. As with all clients, it must be remembered that each woman's choices express something about who she is as an individual as well as what her cultural values are. Lesbian choices, as any behavior that violates strict cultural norms, can present a high personal cost to any woman. In the case of Latinas, this high personal cost may additionally involve a loss of support from their ethnic group. Any encouragement of their coming out as lesbian should be done with sensitivity to the other components of their identity. The therapist should keep in mind that there is as much danger in explaining individual differences away as culturally determined as there is in ignoring or rejecting the impact of cultural influences on each woman's choices. As always in therapy, validation of each woman's identity and of all components of her total self is provided through the expansion of feelings of feeling states and encouragement of understanding their meaning. To understand the multiplicity of tasks involved in identity development for Latina lesbians and to provide the opportunity for the accomplishment of those tasks is the first step in therapy with Latina lesbians. And I'm quickly going to flash the questionnaire so you guys can pause and read if you want, because it was mentioned in the thing. Okay.